Good morning, and I want to thank you all for your patience. While this is an important report, the breakfast that was in here before was evidently more important, and so we had to clear everything out. And we're very appreciative of your willingness to bear with us. I'd like to introduce at the outset the members of this committee: the ranking Democrat, Norm Dix from Washington; the Vice Chairman of the committee, Porter Goss, who is also the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and Mr. Dix, throughout the 105th Congress, served as the ranking member on that committee; Doug Bereiter from Nebraska, who is the vice chairman of the International Relations Committee and who is the chairman of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee; Jim Hansen, who is the chairman of the Committee on Standards and a senior member of the Committee on National Security and a past member of the Intelligence Committee; John Spratt, who is a senior member of the Committee on National Security; Kurt Weldon, who is chairman of the Committee on National Security's Subcommittee on Military Research and Development; Lucille Roybal Allard, who is a member of the Committee on Banking, Financial Services, and the Budget; Representative Bobby Scott, who is the ranking member on the Committee on the Judiciary's Subcommittee on the Constitution. I am Chris Cox, and this is a committee occasionally referred to as the Cox Committee, I think chiefly because the actual name is too long to say or pronounce in under 2 or 3 minutes. It's the U.S. National Security and Military Commercial Concerns with the People's Republic of China Select Committee. But it isn't the Cox Committee. It is the committee comprised of the 9 of us, and more importantly than that, all of our staff. I'd like to congratulate first the leadership of the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, who was then Newt Gingrich and who is now Denny Hastert, and the Minority Leader, Dick Gephardt, because in a very real sense, this too is their committee. They chose the members to serve on this committee, and while some have said at various times this Select Committee wasn't doing exactly what the Democratic or Republican leadership wished it to do, the truth is that this is a hand-picked committee from our top leadership on both sides, and they have been remarkably supportive throughout our efforts. Never at any time during the committee's work did any member of the leadership on the Democratic or Republican sides tell us to tamp down our investigation or to color in any way our findings, and we have not done so. We have reported back faithfully as they asked us to do. We had 47 professional staff on this committee, who both the ranking member, Norm Dix, and I interviewed, and who reported to both of us. They served all of the members on the committee well in what was throughout a remarkably joint effort. I'd like to single out today, of the 47, the most senior members of that staff, in particular the staff director, Dean McGrath, who has served on national security matters in the White House in 3 administrations; Mike Sheehy, who is the Special Minority Counsel for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, serves in that capacity today and served as our Chief Minority Counsel. He also was a member of the Iran-Contra Investigating Committee. Our Chief Investigative Counsel was Rick Cincagrano, who took leave from his position at the CIA and has returned now to his position at the CIA as the Deputy Inspector General there. Dan Silver, who served as counsel to our joint staff, was previously the General Counsel of the CIA and the General Counsel of the National Security Agency. Louis Libby served at the State Department, in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense. Dick Meltzer, our Chief Minority Counsel, served as the Chief Investigative Counsel on the Iranian Arms Transfers to Bosnia Committee. Michael Davidson served as the U.S. Senate Legal Counsel and served us well on this committee. Dr. Alexander Flax, our senior scientist, was formerly the president for the Institute for Defense Analysis and the director of the National Reconnaissance Office. Nick Rostow previously served as the legal advisor to the National Security Council. As you can see, these and the other members of our 47 staff, many of whom came on detail from the FBI and the CIA, are not denizens of Capitol Hill. They have served not only in the executive branch, but in the highest levels of policymaking in our national security structure. And their professionalism was exhibited throughout this investigation. Finally, we are indebted to the Rumsfeld Commission, which preceded us just by weeks when they presented their unanimous and bipartisan report on ballistic missile threats to the United States. We followed their model of bipartisanship. We reached their result of a unanimous and bipartisan conclusion. But we also hired some of their staff. And we are very, very grateful for the guidance that that staff provided and that Don Rumsfeld and his fellow commissioners provided to us. Our unanimous report finally shows that Congress can work well together. We operated during very trying times. But we focused on the matters at hand, and every time we had a disagreement, we returned to the facts. And what is included in our classified report are exclusively facts. You will see in our unclassified version that we are distributing today that there are judgments of the Select Committee, there are estimates of what might happen. But I assure you that all of those sentences, all of those phrases are necessarily written to protect intelligence sources and methods in order to make sure that the facts that we simply cannot disclose to you for national security reasons are protected. Our committee did not engage in surmise. We did not engage in opinion. We reported only facts, and that is why we could agree with one another. Briefly, here are our key findings. First, we were asked to report on the cooperation of two U.S. firms, Loral and Hughes, with the People's Republic of China's rocket efforts and indirectly with their missile efforts. The Select Committee has concluded that, in fact, information passed during the failure analyses performed by those two corporations in the wake of 3 failed launches not only directly improved the Long March rocket itself, which is the workhorse for the People's Liberation Army's military spacelift capacity, but also each of those failure analyses has the potential to benefit the PRC's ballistic missile program. In the aftermath of these 3 failed satellite launches, these U.S. satellite manufacturers transferred missile design information and know-how to the PRC without obtaining the legally required licenses. This information has improved the reliability of PRC rockets that are useful for not only civilian but also military purposes. The illegally transmitted information is useful for the design and improved reliability of PRC ballistic missiles in the future as well. The Select Committee was also concerned because in both cases, Loral and Hughes acted without the legally required license, although both corporations knew that a license was required. In light of the PRC's aggressive espionage campaign detailed in our 3-volume report, exceeding 900 pages that we are releasing today, it would be surprising if the PRC has not exploited security lapses that have occurred in connection with launches of U.S. satellites in the PRC. And our report details a number of those security lapses. I think you will see that there is ample justification for the Select Committee's recommendation that security at PRC launch sites be handled very differently in the future. We were quickly led, after our initial investigation into the Loral and Hughes matters, into broader questions of PRC espionage directed against U.S. military secrets. And what we were sad to learn is that the People's Republic of China has stolen classified information on every currently deployed warhead in the U.S. ballistic missile arsenal. The PRC has also stolen information on the neutron bomb, which the United States has not yet deployed. These thefts began in the late 1970s, continued during the 1980s and 90s, and significantly, our report concludes it is exceptionally likely that penetration of our U.S. national weapons laboratories continues to this very day. According to the unanimous judgment of the Select Committee, the PRC will exploit elements of that stolen U.S. thermonuclear weapons information in its future designs, including a weapon that could be deployed as early as 2002. The Select Committee unanimously agreed that security at our national weapons laboratories does not meet even minimal standards and will not meet even minimal standards until sometime next year. The Select Committee found that since 1996, the United States has sent more than 600 high-speed, so-called high-performance computers to the People's Republic of China, compared to none before 1996, and that these computers are necessary in order for the People's Liberation Army to perfect what already it has stolen. The Select Committee judges that U.S. high-performance computers have been used by the PRC to perform nuclear weapons calculations and for other military purposes. The United States currently has no means to prevent high-performance computers from being diverted to military purposes, and for this reason the Select Committee has unanimously recommended that, incorporated into the terms of trade and future sales of high-performance computers, be realistic, serious end-use verification. Even though we discovered in 1995 that the PRC had stolen vast amounts of design information, the National Security Advisor informed the Select Committee that the President was not briefed until early 1998. That has been amended in the version of the report that we're putting out today to reflect the fact that even though records do not exist from an earlier meeting, that an earlier briefing, according to the National Security Advisor, took place in 1997. But others at the top of our government structure were not informed in a timely fashion, including the Secretaries of Commerce and State, who are responsible for enforcing the export licensing regime of militarily sensitive technology to the People's Republic of China. And not least in importance, the Congress was not properly kept informed. The administration, we unanimously found, did not adequately comply with the terms of the National Security Act requiring that reporting to Congress. In the late 1990s, the PRC illegally obtained U.S. technology to detect submarines, enabling the PRC, if they successfully complete their own work on this information, to threaten previously invulnerable U.S. nuclear submarines. In the late 1990s, the PRC illegally obtained U.S. research on electromagnetic weapons that can be used for space-based weapons. But information acquired in the 90s is only the most recent of what the Select Committee found. Currently deployed PRC ICBMs targeted on U.S. cities, these are ICBMs deployed during the 1990s, are based on 1950s U.S. Titan missile technology, which originated in the United States. Now General Chian of the People's Liberation Army, who graduated from MIT and worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, worked on our Titan program, and along with 3 others then accused of espionage, went to the PRC and became the father of the PLA's ballistic missile program. Our Select Committee report emphasizes this point because it illustrates the long-term consequences of this kind of technology transfer. Today, our cities are being held in threat by technology that left the United States decades ago, and undoubtedly, because the PRC is a significant proliferator, in fact, according to the Clinton administration, the most significant proliferator of weapons of mass destruction technology in the world. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, we may be looking at this information that has been stolen from the United States in the hands of regimes much less stable than the People's Republic of China, third world and rogue states that engage in unpredictable behavior. In conclusion, the PRC has mounted a widespread effort to obtain U.S. military technology by any means, legal or illegal. The PRC has induced U.S. businesses to provide military-related technology for commercial motives. The PRC has induced U.S. businesses to lobby for liberalized export standards with the ultimate result of being able to assemble information for military purposes. I urge you to read the full report. I urge you to pay particular attention to the 38 recommendations that the Select Committee has forwarded to the Congress and to the administration. What we are doing here today, I hope, will be a beginning, not an end. I hope that we will be able to cooperate with the administration and with the committees in the Senate as well as in the House to enact our recommendations and to do whatever is necessary to make sure that while some of these horses have gotten out the barn door, that further information, further technology that is necessary for both the PRC and other countries into whose hands this information might fall, to perfect it, to use it, to weaponize it, and to deploy it, does not, in fact, leave our lockup. I'd like to introduce Representative Norm Dix, whose expertise on these matters as the ranking member on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and as a senior member of the Armed Services Committee, along with the expertise of the other members that you see assembled here, was instrumental in making our work possible. Norm and I dare say Porter and I or any of the members here, don't agree on everything. We tried to leave our disagreements on the cutting room floor and put into this report those things that we agreed upon because of the importance of that message and the importance that we do something about it. I am honored to have worked with Representative Dix. I'm honored to have worked with all the members who stand behind me, and I yield gladly the podium to the ranking Democrat on the Select Committee.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. One of the nation's greatest leaders, the late Senator from Washington State, Henry M. Jackson, used to say, when it comes to national security, the best politics is no politics. His words were an inspiration to me at the outset and throughout the work of this Select Committee. When I accepted Dick Gephardt's request to take this assignment in June of last year, the country was facing the prospects of the House impeaching the President, and the political environment in the nation's capital was as partisan and as mean-spirited as I've seen it in 30 years here. Chris Cox and I agreed that for 6 months, 9 members could be Americans first, putting aside partisan considerations. The Select Committee was given the assignment by the House to investigate the transfer of technology to China, as the chairman mentioned, focusing first on the security breaches that took place surrounding the launching of 2 U.S. satellites on Chinese rockets. The committee soon found itself immersed in unraveling a major counterintelligence failure at the Department of Energy's national laboratories. Let me point out that this was a counterintelligence failure that began as early as the late 80s, and it continued through late 70s, and it continued through the 80s and into the 90s. It is serious, no doubt one of the worst counterintelligence failures in the nation's history. And it occurred even though, according to Notre Trulock, 2 previous efforts were made to strengthen counterintelligence in the last 10 years. It is now clear that these earlier efforts failed because DOE officials did not give counterintelligence officials the authority, the staffing, the resources, and the mandate within the department to get the job done. After traveling to the laboratories and interviewing counterintelligence officials, the Department of Energy's new counterintelligence director, Ed Curran, reported in November 1998, the counterintelligence program at DOE does not meet minimal standards. There is not a counterintelligence program, nor has there been one at DOE for many, many years. He concluded that 2 past attempts to improve counterintelligence capability at the labs faltered because counterintelligence directors were not given direct access to the Secretary of Energy, and because lab directors in many cases ignored the demand for change and thwarted the suggested improvements. It is probable that if the previous efforts had succeeded, a significant amount of nuclear warhead design data and information lost to the PRC would not have occurred. That's why it is essential at this time for this Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, to make certain that the serious program of counterintelligence improvements now being implemented by Energy Secretary Bill Richardson and Counterintelligence Director Curran are taken seriously, and that the labs become more responsible and accountable. Secretary Richardson has assured the chairman and I in writing that the Select Committee recommendations and PDD 61 are being fully implemented. The Select Committee started its investigation in July 1998. In the fall of 1998, we received a briefing that presented the document given to the CIA by a walk-in that showed that the PRC had stolen design information on 2 nuclear warheads, the W-88 and the W-70, and had stolen technical information on 5 other U.S. warheads. When I saw the dimension of the counterintelligence failure, I immediately went to my former colleague, Secretary Bill Richardson, to urge him to accept all of the counterintelligence recommendations of Counterintelligence Director Ed Curran. Specifically, I urge acceptance of Mr. Curran's recommendation to give the Counterintelligence Director direct access to the Secretary, and that lab personnel with access to special access programs or top secret information on nuclear warheads be given periodic polygraph examinations. As we speak, Ed Curran is implementing a credible counterintelligence program at our national labs. With support from Congress and the leadership that Secretary Richardson is demonstrating now in the department, we can get Mr. Curran's complete program in place by FY 2000, just a few months away. A few weeks ago, Chairman Chris Cox and I briefed the President on the Select Committee's report, which he received in classified form in January. As was evident at the meeting, the President is thoroughly engaged on these issues. He has accepted our recommendations and has pledged to implement the vast majority of them. In fact, the President signed Presidential Decision Directive 61 in February of 1998, ordering a new counterintelligence program at the DOE labs. This occurred 4 months before this Select Committee was created by the House. Some of the Select Committee's recommendations will require legislative implementation by the Congress. In fact, Congressman John Spratt and I have worked with our colleagues on a package of amendments to the National Security Authorization Bill. These amendments include giving the Counterintelligence Director statutory access to the Secretary of Energy's office. Let me also state that the conclusions of the report have been written in a worst-case fashion. I am certain that academics and experts in and out of government will challenge some of our worst-case conclusions. It was my intention, with the help of my colleagues, to add balance to the report. But I wanted foremost to assure that the DOE labs got the message this time. With the publication of this report, I believe we have succeeded in that objective. The PRC has obtained designs of 2 nuclear warheads and technical data on 5 other warheads. This clearly helps them advance the capability of their nuclear weapons program if they have the resources, engineering, and scientific talent to do so. They clearly have made progress testing their version of the W-88 and the W-70. As of today, the PRC has not deployed a single new nuclear weapon based on the information they have obtained. In fact, they obtained the W-70 information in the late 70s, tested in 1988, yet it has not been deployed. They obtained W-88 information probably as early as 1984, tested it between 92 and 96, and yet have not deployed it. The DF-31 missile has been in development for 15 years, but it has not been deployed. I agree with the Chairman that if they do deploy these weapons, that there will be elements from the stolen designs that will be part of their new program. So let us keep this report in perspective. The United States still possesses overwhelming nuclear superiority over China, with more than 6,000 strategic nuclear warheads currently in our inventory, compared to China's total of about 24. The People's Republic of China has for years had nuclear weapons capable of reaching the United States, but the PRC's nuclear force is retaliatory in nature. The information obtained from the United States will not change that character. In addition, as I mentioned before, it remains to be seen what use the PRC can make of the information it has acquired. Even testing a nuclear device does not ensure its successful mating with a delivery vehicle. The PRC's record of assimilating foreign technology has not been very good. The committee also found that the amount of information the PRC had acquired from the United States pales in comparison to the amount it has been provided by other countries, notably Russia. This report should serve as a reminder that the United States remains a primary target of countries desiring advanced technologies for military and other purposes. The PRC has been successful in acquiring some technology. Other countries are active as well. Preventing future losses requires vigilance by the government, both Congress and the executive branch, and by industry. Our defensive efforts have clearly not been good enough in the past 20 years, but I am confident that they will improve as a direct result of this report. Finally, I would like to express my personal thanks to all of the members who contributed so much of their personal time and insight to this important work. The committee worked long and hard, and their participation required great sacrifice, to say the least. And I would commend the committee's hardworking staff and certainly my special assistant, Mike Sheehy, for their diligence and their endurance through which was supposed to be a 6-month effort, but it lasted for 11. Most of all, I want to say to Chairman Cox, you did a first-rate job for the Congress and for the nation, and we thank you for your extraordinary leadership.
We have a number of extraordinary leaders here and some extraordinary compliments. I'm very grateful. But Norm Dix and Porter Goss are extraordinary leaders of the Intelligence Committee during the 105th Congress. Porter Goss continues as the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He served as the vice chairman of this committee, and because of his long expertise in this area, the Select Committee was especially benefited. I introduce to you the Vice Chairman of the Select Committee, Porter Goss, from Florida.
Thank you, Chris. Again, I want to join in the plaudits for both of you gentlemen, Chairman Cox and Norm Dix, I've had the pleasure of working with. And it goes to show that the United States Congress is a very credible institution that does very fine work for the people of America. I think every member here, when they were introduced in this committee, would be regarded as Congressman or Congresswoman so-and-so, instead of a D or an R after their name, an A after their name for American. I honestly believe we did a product for the United States of America. The oversight that came out of this, I think, has been very useful. We are making positive recommendations. And it's important that we make positive recommendations because our defenses aren't at the level they should be. A couple of things have become very clear, and most of this has been said, and I will be very brief so you can get right to the report or questions or whatever the program calls for. One is that it is not a good idea for the benefit of commerce to over-engage at the expense of national security. And I think that has happened. In fact, I don't know how all the decision process worked out on that, but our job was to balance. We added up the pluses and minuses, and when we came down, we discovered that in the transfer of technology, we came out second best, and consequently we made some recommendations in that area. And I think that kind of oversight check is very, very important to the activities that go on in the executive branch of government. The second point I would make that falls under my portfolio on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, now with Julian Dixon, my ranking member, Norm Dix formerly, and he will always be there in spirit. And I think we can include him as an honorary member, too. The clear indications are that we have more work to do in investigating. This is a country where we do not spy on Americans. Americans do not spy on Americans. Intelligence is not carried out on other Americans by Americans. We are unique in that in the world. Other countries that you can think of do have ministers of interior or services of interior that go out and keep track of what their citizens are doing. We are a free country. We can be very grateful. The only people who have something to fear are people who break the law. And we have law enforcement for those folks. And that comes under the Department of Justice, the FBI, and they carry the portfolio for counterintelligence to a large degree in compliance with U.S. laws. I think that there is work to be done and improvement to be made in some of the activities of the Department of Justice. There are some areas we cannot talk to you about publicly at this time. Protecting sources is legitimate. We need to do that. We still have active sources, and we would not want to give them away, put them at risk, or lose the flow of information we get. We have national technical means which we don't talk about because it enhances the enemy's denial and deception capability if they know what they are. So we try not to talk too much about those. Then there's a third area you don't hear much about, and that is when there is an active investigation ongoing in the Department of Justice, we normally let that investigation run its course before congressional oversight really starts to poke and prod into those areas. That is an area where I am very concerned that we are getting the maximum amount of attention and effort that needs to be made. We have too many cases out there where there are loose ends that need to be followed in the area of intelligence. I assure you, and I think I can speak for Mr. Dixon, that we will do a diligent job on making sure we have the best possible counterintelligence in our country especially for our most important secrets. But I'm going to tell you that that is going to take the working cooperation of the Department of Justice and the law enforcement people who do this work, and we need to do a lot better than we have been doing. I have been surprised badly as recently as this Sunday on the morning talk shows with new information and a new name, where I was literally ambushed in the elevator going to a talk show with a case I hadn't been briefed on and didn't know anything about. That is not acceptable. Those are the kinds of things we need to correct and work out, and we will be working through. We also found there were an instance or two where information that should have been provided to us by the FBI was not provided to us for whatever reason, and we will explore that further. And I will give credit to Mr. Dix very strongly on this, that routinely in the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, because of Mr. Dix's very strong urging, leadership, and demands, we have been getting regular CI briefings in a very meaningful way to deal with some of the problems that we saw in the Alder James case. Mr. Dix, I think, was one of the first to see the seriousness of the problem at the labs, and he has been very, very persistent in following that. Had it not been for his persistence and the cooperation of the people in the intelligence community to come forward and the vision of Chairman Cox, I think that this report would have been a lot less fulsome than it is now, and I think it is very important in the manner it's presented. Thank you.
It has been my privilege in the past, some years back, to work under the leadership of the member that I'm going to introduce next, Representative John Spratt. He is one of the fairest and wisest members of our Congress. He is a senior member of the House Committee on National Security, and his expertise and his insights on our Select Committee were invaluable. John Spratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This committee was chartered in the wake of allegations about U.S. satellites launched on Chinese rockets. 3 launches failed that were followed up by accident investigations, weren't licensed, should have been by the State Department, with the result that they were tech transferred to China. Mr. Dix has told you that the committee report is written from sort of a worst-case scenario standpoint. And for purposes of sounding the alarm, I think that's appropriate. But I think it's also appropriate to be balanced and to mention a few things that we found were not concerns. First of all, when we started, it was initially alleged that U.S. encryption technology possibly had been compromised when 3 satellites went down with their launches. These rumors turned out to be largely unfounded. It was also alleged that Motorola had helped China design a platform for offloading Iridium satellites that would be a precursor to a so-called post-boost vehicle from which MIRV RVs could be offloaded. This, too, was unfounded and not included in the report. Finally, it was alleged that Hughes and Loral had helped China improve the accuracy and range and payload of its rockets and missiles. The report deals with their launch failure investigations in detail and concludes that China's rockets and missiles may have gained as a result in reliability, but probably not in range, payload, or accuracy. Ironically, the greatest contribution to China's reliability probably came from the decision made in 1988 to allow American satellites to be launched on Soviet rockets. There have been 28 to date, Chinese rockets. There have been 28 to date, all paid for by somebody else. And in effect, this is a way for the Chinese to underwrite the development of their rocket and missile program. What have we learned from all of this? We've learned for sure that the culture of compliance when it comes to export control rules is weak, particularly when the possibility of profits is high. We need tighter rules. If we're going to stop technology transfer, we need tighter rules, closer oversight, tougher sanctions, more monitors, better training, and more export control officers. But we're lucky to learn this lesson without having lost very much. Our losses in this case, in my estimation, were not equivalent to the losses in the Toshiba case when we lost to the Soviets the technology that was a secret to our submarine's quietness. If the committee had ended its work here, the report would have raised serious concerns about export controls and technology transfer and Chinese intentions, but nothing radically earth-shaking. But in mid-October, the committee staff learned that design data about the W-88 warhead, our preeminent best warhead, had been lost to Chinese espionage. The committee heard testimony about these losses at its hearings on November 12 and December 16. Due to the shortness of time, the record on this subject, serious subject, is thinner than the record that is voluminous compiled on Hughes and Lorrell. And there are cases in the analysis of it where we did not delete things that I disagree with. We did make changes in the markup, but I would like simply to say in the way of additional views how I view those particular statements. First of all, the committee reports that we picked up this information in 1995 from a walk-in, a PRC walk-in. The National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, was informed of the apparent espionage in April of '96. For some reason, the President was not briefed until early 1998, and this presidential decision directive that Mr. Dix mentioned wasn't issued until February of 1998. The administration has been criticized for not acting quickly enough or vigorously enough, but I think we in the Congress should ask ourselves, did we act quickly enough or vigorously enough? We should ask ourselves about the adequacy of congressional oversight. The House and Senate Intelligence Committees received a similar briefing and neither really sounded an alarm or took vigorous action itself. And I think one of the reasons is that as the information came in, the investigation seemed to be unfinished and incomplete, and the facts were still fragmentary and uncertain. Indeed, this committee took 3 staff briefings, 1 from the FBI, 2 from DOE, and multiple telephone calls just to get the facts for this report prepared 2 years after the National Security Advisor was first briefed. Still, I have to say I'm baffled by how this investigation has been handled. But as you look back in the history of the relationship between the FBI and DOE, there's security lapses and a lack of coordination that date back to the 1980s, when the information about the W-70 was lost. And red flags were raised that should have been heeded and weren't. The first call for beefed up security as to China and counterintelligence came then, in the early 1980s, when the loss of the W-70 design data was confirmed. When in 1988, China tested a neutron bomb, the call for stronger security and counterintelligence against China should have been absolutely unmistaken. Among those calling for additional security, tighter security, were the General Accounting Office and the House Energy and Commerce Committee. The GAO has written 30 reports on this subject since 1980, about 20 of which go to security of the national labs. Mr. Dingell, to his credit, over at the Oversight Committee, kept up the drumbeat to have an independent office of safeguards and evaluations, only to be met with assurances that they were making significant progress. But it was during this period of time, when the Dingell drumbeat was growing and GAO was issuing these reports, this period of time between 84 and 92, that the design information for the W-88 warhead was stolen by Chinese agents. These are troubling facts, but they need to be kept in perspective. We relied on a few witnesses out of necessity, and we didn't substantiate their testimony with the experts at the national labs, and there's some statements in the report that I think go a bit far. I objected to a number of these during the markup of the overview, but some were deleted, some were revised. I'd like to call attention to just 2. 2 sentences stand out. The opening sentence of the overview states that the PRC has stolen design information on the United States' most advanced thermonuclear weapons. It is followed by the statement that the stolen U.S. nuclear secrets give the PRC design information on thermonuclear weapons on a par with our own. Now, that's alarming, but is it accurate? Mr. Dix has told you what the intelligence committees or community's best estimate of the PRC's obtaining has been. Design information on the W-70 for sure, implemented in the explosion of a bomb in the 1980s. Design information on the W-88 warhead. How complete, we don't know. Design information on its RV, its reentry vehicle. Classified information on reentry vehicles and weight-to-yield ratios on the W-62, the W-76, the W-78, and the W-87. But the Intelligence Committee does not know how big the base of this iceberg is, how much to infer from the size of the tip of this iceberg. They do not know specifically whether weapons blueprints or design documents have been stolen. As for loss of the neutron or radiation technology in the mid-1990s, which is also referred to in the report, the evidence here is limited. There's no settled conclusion yet within the intelligence community about its significance. This information, if it was stolen, is really esoteric physics that does not have a lot of military application. I'm taking up my colleagues' time. Let me just close with something about the legacy codes that occurred, the discovery that occurred after we completed our report. If they have been stolen, it's an alarming loss. Even if they have not been stolen, the fact that they could be downloaded from a classified computer to an unclassified computer itself raises grave questions about security in our national labs. A lot of what our scientists know about nuclear materials is empirically based rather than scientifically derived. The legacy codes are mathematical equations that model phenomena that are observed in the explosion of nuclear weapons. They record neutrons and protons moving through matter, shock waves going through materials, the effects of heat. It's a treasure load of empirical data. And if the PRC has obtained these codes, they will enhance clearly their ability to model nuclear explosions. But these legacy codes are not the three-dimensional models of bombs or CAD/CAM's designs, and even if these codes have been lost, it's a bit much to say that these codes give the PRC design information on par with our own. Now, I'm not competent to make that statement to you. I do know that we have had 1,100 nuclear tests as opposed to about 50 on their part. We built over 30,000 nuclear warheads as opposed to a few hundred at most on their part. So that would suggest to you that we have a somewhat greater capability for nuclear design than they do. But take it from Harold Agnew. Read his letter to the Wall Street Journal on May the 17th, which said, the W-88 is actually quite an old design. The basic test was done at Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory when I was director. I retired 20 years ago. It's a neat package, but having the computer printouts gives you only a general idea. Actually being able to manufacture the total system from a computer code is a different matter. No nation would ever stockpile any device based on another nation's computer codes. Because of the shortness of time, we didn't have the opportunity to call witnesses like Dr. Agnew. I think if we had, we would have made a better investigative record, and some of the statements that were made in the overview probably would have been left on the cutting room floor. One final point. At most, what we can hope from export controls, counterintelligence, is to slow down, impede, retard the development of Chinese nuclear weapons and delivery systems such as ballistic missiles. They are a capable country. They have capable scientists, and they have other sources of technology like the Russians who have given them copious quantities of information. So at most we can hope to impede, slow down, and extend the pace. We probably cannot hope to completely prevent that development. In that connection, probably the most effective device we can use to slow them down at this point in their development cycle is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The last amendment I offered the committee, which was not accepted, was to say that at the end of the report, that the CTBT has the kind of impediment, poses a kind of major impediment to them as opposed to a minor impediment to us, and it should be viewed in that light and in light of what we found in this report. Thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to introduce the senior member of the House International Relations Committee, ranking only behind the chairman of the full committee. He is the vice chairman of the International Relations Committee. He is the chairman of the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee, and I think it is fair to say the person in the Congress most knowledgeable about U.S. PRC relations and U.S.-Asia policy. I'm referring to Congressman Chairman Doug Beereiter of Nebraska.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to say, first of all, about the committee, about Chairman Cox, Ranking Member Norm Dix, and all the members of the committee. I think this committee might fairly be considered a model of how a congressional investigative committee really should conduct its business. During the course of our investigation through January 3rd, as one example, there were no leaks from the committee. I think perhaps much to the frustration of the news media. I would also say, however, and remind you that what we have done is not a comprehensive survey of espionage that has been conducted against the United States by the People's Republic of China. It is not a comprehensive survey. What we have done very thoroughly, but we have done this based upon the original direction and information that was brought to our attention by leaks within the bureaucracy in the course of that investigation. A couple of things that I can perhaps contribute beyond what has already been said. First of all, I'm a counterintelligence officer in the Army, and I served on the Intelligence Committee for 6 years here. Counterintelligence is never the glamorous part of intelligence game, but it is very important. And I would say that what has happened collectively over the course of several decades here with respect to espionage conducted against the United States by the People's Republic of China is the gravest single loss of our nation's most sensitive secrets ever. There is really no doubt about that. We have not provided the worst case scenario, but neither should you construct the best case scenario. One of the things that has happened, of course, is it's made it much less likely that we will be able to understand the weaponization and the deployment of nuclear weapons. Nor should we limit our discussion to the losses in espionage from our DOE labs to nuclear or thermonuclear issues. That's not, of course, all of what they do there. I would also say that in this respect, I believe that one needs to look at the orientation of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is, of course, the appropriate agency to conduct the overall responsibilities for counterintelligence in our country. There's not a better location for that. That's the safest place to have it. But in reality, I think they have gone forward with a law enforcement orientation. The first priority on getting convictions and moving right up the line to conviction, somewhere above it in the highest levels of our government, must be a responsibility given for quickly intervening when the loss to our national security is so damaging that we really have to move people out of the way. Now, I think that is one of the failures here. The failure to understand that some things are more important than getting in a conviction. Some things are more important than nailing somebody right up on the line. And I think it would also be a mistake to suggest that the one or two names you have heard involved in espionage activity is the end of the story. There's no doubt in my mind that counterintelligence failure continues today in our agencies, certainly within the Department of Energy. There is a cultural change that is needed there. We have some wonderful people working there, highly informed about proper use of intelligence and safeguarding of it, but we have a major problem there. And half measures are not the solution. We need to make sure that what is done there now, under the leadership at this moment of Secretary Richardson, with close supervision from the Congress and the people in the executive branch, is adequate to begin to correct the problem and to end the significant problem. We should also recognize that intelligence gathering, espionage, is an activity in which governments involve it themselves. There's no surprise that our nuclear labs, where we're developing the most sensitive weapons you can imagine, at great expense to the American taxpayer, was a target of espionage by the People's Republic of China and other countries. That's not a shock. What is so gravely disappointing, which creates so much anger in our citizenry, is the fact that we had the incompetence, the naivete, and the lack of security to have permitted this to happen. But we should not fail to act in our national interest in the future when it comes to our relationship with the PRC. And that brings me to my second and final point that I might contribute here today, and that is related to our foreign policy relationships with the People's Republic of China. I think that in simplest form, underlying our concept of our relationship with the People's Republic of China has been the view that this is an evolving country. And we have a weapons technology lead of 20 to 30 years. Now it's clear that that has been reduced and potentially could have been reduced dramatically by what has been learned if in fact they're successful in weaponizing some of the design information that they've received on thermonuclear weapons and other weapons. So we may not have that lead. And it is not just a matter of balance between ICBMs. It is a matter of whether we can pursue our national interests, whether or not we are going to be intimidated, whether or not we're going to take the steps necessary in the East Asian area to protect our responsibilities, our national interests there, and responsibilities with our allies. So now it seems to me, as we look at what has happened, we need to completely reevaluate our relationship with the People's Republic of China. And the guideline, it seems to me, that everything we do with respect to the PRC must not only be in the long-term national interest, counting on them to evolve to a country that is not necessarily our adversary, but one in which we can have a complementary relationship. Everything must be in our short-term and long-term national interest. That must be the guideline for our relationship with the PRC. We must not fail to act on things that are important to our relationship because we are so disturbed. The focus of our energy and our concern now ought to be on the 38 recommendations and other actions that prove to be necessary that we make to the executive branch and to Congress itself for improving our situation and to protect our most sensitive secrets. Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard is a fellow Southern Californian, and as I mentioned, worked on the Banking Committee, the Budget Committee during the 105th Congress. Today serves on the Appropriations Committee, and was, as the other members here, extraordinarily diligent in learning throughout scores of hearings and interviews of literally hundreds of witnesses, a great deal of information in a short period of time. It's an opportunity for me to mention that this group standing here received essentially no credit, even going into an election, for working throughout the entirety of the July 4th recess, the August recess, the election period itself, holidays that we would have rather spent with our families, Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, all the way through New Year's. And as you saw, the report date and all of the writing that we're passing out to you today was January 3. So I want to thank personally my fellow Southern Californian who, along with Norm Dix, had to travel cross-country always to be with us during all those periods. Lucille Roybal Allard.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me associate myself with the comments that have been made with the other speakers. But I would like to focus on one area that the committee investigated, and that is the adequacy of U.S. policies regarding security at the Chinese launch sites. Under current export laws, U.S. satellite manufacturers are responsible for site security when a U.S. satellite is launched in China. And to fulfill this responsibility, the company most often contracts with a private guard force to provide that security. Unfortunately, what we found was that there were numerous problems with the security personnel hired by U.S. satellite companies, including guards sleeping on the job, an insufficient number of security personnel at the launch sites, and guards reporting to work under the influence of alcohol. When the companies were asked, why they didn't get another company to fulfill these responsibilities, we were amazed to learn that there is only one company, one security company in the nation in recent years that bids on and receives contracts to provide site launch security in China. In other words, good or bad, it's the only game in town because there is no competition. To remedy these problems, among other things, the committee has recommended that the Department of Defense, not the satellite manufacturers, be responsible for contracting the necessary security personnel for foreign launches. We felt that this would also help to eliminate any conflict of interest that may result from the fact that the manufacturers were the employers of the security company. The committee also found numerous deficiencies in the Defense Department's monitoring and oversight of satellite launches in China. As it exists today, the Defense Department oversees security by assigning a DoD monitor to pre-launch meetings where sensitive technology may be discussed and to each launch site in China. This DoD monitor is responsible for resolving security problems at the launch site and reporting any security infractions to their supervisor at DoD if they cannot resolve the problem themselves. In examining DoD's oversight of security, the committee found several weaknesses in the current system. Among them are that DoD monitors are assigned to launches on a temporary, rotating basis. This leads to inconsistent monitoring of security on launches. The DOT also monitors often lack the technical expertise and the training which is necessary to properly monitor security breaches. The committee also found that the monitors were often not given adequate support and backup from their supervisors at DoD when they did report a breach in security. Among the recommendations made by the committee to remedy this problem are for DoD to develop a permanent monitoring force with extensive technical training and to adopt regulations to ensure that security violations are properly documented and reported to the appropriate government authorities. It is important to note, however, that DoD has already begun to make improvements to its monitoring program, including taking steps to develop a permanent corps of well-trained monitors. However, legislative action may be needed to implement some of the other recommendations in this area. Let me just say that despite the numerous weaknesses that we found with the current system, it is also important to note that the committee found no evidence that any of these infractions by the security guards or the weaknesses in the oversight of DoD resulted in the transfer of unauthorized technology to China. In fact, the Department of Defense experts advised this committee that a team of individuals would need at least 2 continuous hours of unsupervised access to a satellite in order to learn any not otherwise available on the Internet or in trade publications. The committee found no evidence that such an opportunity of this type of access existed at a launch in China. However, it is still true that the potential for technology transfers does exist, and that many of the findings contained in this report are indeed grave. Therefore, I join my colleagues on the Select Committee in urging the appropriate congressional committees to take action to implement these recommendations as soon as possible so American companies can export satellites to China without undue risk to our national security. This is critical because if the U.S. stops exporting satellites for launch in China, foreign competitors with little or no security restrictions on the sharing of technical information to countries such as China are waiting and willing to step in to fill the void left by U.S. companies. We must not miss this important point. For that reason, I hope that my colleagues in Congress will follow the model of this committee, put party politics aside, and act in the best interests of the country by working with the administration to find solutions to these problems and ensure that our national security is, in fact, protected. Thank you.
Chairman Jim Hansen, and this is a committee of chairmen, actually has chairman's responsibilities right now in a markup, and he has had to leave, and I would have introduced him at this point, but I want to add to what I said earlier, how deeply grateful all of us are for the work that Chairman Hansen put into this committee with his deep background in national security matters. I'd like then to introduce Representative Bobby Scott, who had unique challenges during our Select Committee's work, because in addition to the frankly overwhelming workload that we placed on his shoulders, while we were working in secret, there was something else going on in the Capitol. He served as a member of the House Judiciary Committee and thus gets Purple Heart for doing the 2 most difficult things then going on in Washington, D.C. He was, frankly, because I know I read in the newspaper that he was involved conducting his own hearings as a ranking member on Judiciary. He was certainly carrying his load over there, but there was no evidence whatever that he had anything else to do but this Select Committee, because we had his undivided time and attention. He showed up for everything, and his staff were exceptionally able and contributed very much to the overall effort of the Joint Staff. He served as I mentioned, as the chairman of the subcommittee, or the ranking member of the subcommittee on the Constitution, and now serves as the ranking member on the subcommittee on crime, something not entirely irrelevant to the topics that we're addressing today. Representative Bobby Scott.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Chairman Cox and Ranking Member Dix for their leadership and reiterate what others have said, and that is that this committee worked diligently in a nonpartisan fashion, and for that reason, all of the members of the committee could unanimously agree on our report. This report contains important information about espionage at our national labs dealing with nuclear weapons. Starting in the 1970s and continuing for decades, terrible mistakes were made, which allowed classified nuclear weapons information to be compromised. Our goal has been to reduce the chances that similar mistakes might be made in the future. We have not dwelled on partisan finger-pointing because there's plenty of blame to go around. We have instead focused on constructive recommendations for the future. The focus of my remarks will be on that part of the report which examined exports of technology to China, an issue where the impact on national security is not always clear-cut. Export controls on numerous commercial items, such as telecommunications, computers, and satellites, were loosened in the 1990s due in part to pressure from members of both parties in Congress. These commercial items have both military and civilian applications and are subject to license by the federal government to ensure that they are exported responsibly. On the whole, the committee found that export of commercial items to China, including high-performance computers, is in the best interest of the United States. We recommended, however, that controls of such as in-use verification of these items be strengthened and that the Export Administration Act be reauthorized by Congress to ensure that tough penalties are applied to those who violate license restrictions. One chapter of our report deals specifically with high-performance computers, or HPCs. HPCs are something of a special case among high-technology exports because the United States currently enjoys an unusual dominance in this industry. Our only true competitor at the high end is Japan, and this dominance means that we can control computer technology export to an extent that is not possible with some other technologies that are widely available from other countries. At the same time, computers in general, and what are defined as high-performance computers in particular, are evolving at a very rapid pace. The supercomputers of just a few years ago can now be outperformed by many of today's home PCs. And because PCs are sold by the millions and are available worldwide, they are impossible to track and control. The committee found that computers, including high-performance computers, can be used for a wide variety of military purposes. The United States policy attempts to control HPCs sent to countries like China, which are of national security concern, at the lowest level at which technology can still be controlled. Furthermore, U.S. policy attempts to restrict use of exported HPCs to civilian, not military purposes. But we noted that controlling access to computing power is a very difficult task, particularly in light of the ability to link several computers together to increase their collective computing capability. However, the committee did conclude that the United States should seek improvements in verifying how U.S. HPCs are actually being used in China. The United States only recently obtained Chinese acceptance for in-use verification visits, and they must be implemented more widely, especially for HPCs. One of the potential uses for HPCs is in the area of nuclear weapons. China is in a uniquely difficult position in its nuclear weapons program because it agreed to abide by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996. At that time, China had developed but had not fully tested a new generation of nuclear devices. For this reason, computer simulation could be a useful tool in compensating for China's lack of test data. Now, on a final note, the committee did not closely examine issues relating to campaign finances. However, executive branch and civil service witnesses who appeared before the committee were asked if any political pressure was applied to them to change any decision about export controls, and the universal response was that no political pressure had been applied.
As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I had a strong interest in that issue because, as the chairman mentioned, the work of this committee occurred at the same time that the Judiciary Committee was considering the issue of impeachment. Although some had originally speculated that impeachable behavior would be found by this committee, we've in fact found nothing worthy of a referral to the Judiciary Committee. Thank you.
The foremost expert on military research and development in the United States Congress is Representative Curt Weldon. He is the chairman of the Armed Services Subcommittee on Military Research and Development. He's also a member of the Committee on Science, an expert in missile defenses, and an exceptional asset to the work of this committee. I'd like to yield to Representative Curt Weldon of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman Cox, and I don't have a prepared statement, so my comments will be brief. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues for the outstanding work that they provided on behalf of the American people in this institution on issues of the most urgent nature in terms of our national security. For 7 months, we worked in a totally nonpartisan way to look at where the problems had been, where they are, without regard to whose administration these problems occurred under. We completed our work in an unusual way because not one member of this committee leaked anything to the media. We made an agreement we wouldn't do that.
It's a miracle.
It's a miracle. And in fact, we carried that out. We finished our work in the first week of January, and we tried to expedite the process of declassifying our report. I can tell you many of us sensed extreme frustration that it took us 4 months to get this report out. 5 months. What further bothered me personally was, without giving us advance notice on February the 1st, 1 month after we completed our work, Sandy Berger at the NSC released to selected media the White House spin in response to our 38 still classified recommendations. That action by Sandy Berger came 2 days before CIA Director George Tenet, in a closed hearing with the National Security Committee in response to a question I asked him, said the CIA hadn't finished reading the report yet, which meant the administration was attempting to spin the recommendations we made before the CIA had even completed their analysis. That was offensive to me personally because of the strong bipartisan and nonpartisan effort of the 9 members on this committee. Today, the American people get to make their own judgments. There's no more case where people can spin what we did without seeing the facts. Today, the American people and our colleagues get to see for themselves and read the information that up until now has largely been provided by rumor, innuendo, or specified leaks by who knows whom. I think it's important that we draw some conclusions here. First of all, in my own opinion, this report is not just about our laboratories. And those who would try to spin this report in that way maybe don't want to look at the breadth and the depth of what we analyzed. Sure, security of our labs is extremely important, but certainly it is not the major issue in the Cox Committee recommendations and findings. Secondarily, there are those who will use this report to cast a negative light on honorable Chinese and Asian Americans, who are the leaders in many cases of our scientific community. Let no one make any mistake that this report is in any way attempting to reflect negatively on the contribution by hundreds of thousands and millions of Asian and Chinese Americans who form the backbone of many of our most complex technical areas of research. That is not the case of our report. There will be others who will spin this report to think that all companies in America who do business with China are out to hurt our security. In fact, the 2 companies we dealt with and others that may have gone too far are the exception rather than the rule. The bulk of our companies doing business with China are good American citizens. They want to do the right thing. Others will use this report to try to create the impression that perhaps China itself is the entire problem, that China has had this endless effort at espionage that has resulted in technology being transferred. Make no mistake about it, there are examples that need further investigation of where the actions of China's government and the PLA in particular need to be examined and questioned. But let me say this, in my opinion, the bulk of the responsibility for the transfers that we've documented don't lie with our American industry, don't lie with China itself. and don't lie with Chinese or Asian Americans. They lie within our own government. A government that has relaxed the export controls, a government that has not had aggressive counterintelligence efforts, a government that has not enforced the very arms control agreements that they would have us agree to. In fact, in the report are documented 37 violations of arms control agreements that we did not take appropriate action to apply the appropriate sanctions. In my opinion, the message of this report, which I would encourage all of you to look at, is that our government has failed the American people. We have failed to take the aggressive steps necessary to protect our technology from being transferred not just to China, but from China to other nations, which China engages in proliferation with. Like my colleagues that have spoken before me, there are things that I would like to have said in the report that are not in the report. Within a few days, I will release 2 pictorial graphs that will document, one, the linkages between the front companies associated with the PLA and the connections that document each of those. And the second will show a timeline showing specific actions taken by the administration and in some cases by the Congress that resulted in technology being transferred. This is the beginning of the discussion in America about what our security relationships need to be, and I hope all Americans will pay close attention.
Thank you very much. A great deal has been written and said about our report before we released it today. I urge you to read it because some of what has been said about it is inaccurate. Some of what has been said about it, as Representative Weldon just said, focused on one or another particular area, and the report is 10 chapters long and deserves a thorough look. So even though Washington is the only city where sound travels faster than light, and you may think that you've heard about everything that's in this report, please read it. We're happy to take your questions. Thank you for your patience. And I just want to say on behalf of everyone who's talking here that if we went what you think might be overly long in presenting our opening remarks, this is a committee that had to work for months and months and months and didn't get to say a word to any of you. So there's a little bit of pent-up frustration here. Yes, thanks.
To how you deal with those problems. Number one is, Mr. Weldon, number two, the impediments to American satellite companies who want to launch perhaps off American rockets, but find that there is too many difficulties associated with that. And then number three, the open exchange of information between American and Chinese scientists. Those are three of the more difficult problems that you face. What do you want to do about it?
First, with respect to front companies, which is one of the means of MSS and other PRC espionage that is described in our report, it is necessary for the intelligence community and the counterintelligence efforts at the Department of Energy and at the FBI to focus in a more systematic and organized way on the problem. Our report observes that throughout the Cold War, necessarily, our investigative resources were focused on the Soviet Union. Happily, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and a shift that might have taken place in consequence of that is only now beginning to take place, but it's very important that it does. The PRC espionage presents different kinds of challenges, and I think all of our witnesses from the administration told us that these special challenges are things to which they are adjusting, but we need to have a more systematized and organized focus. Second, with respect to satellite companies wishing to place their products on top of Long March rockets, our Select Committee unanimously stated what I hope is now obvious, and that is that increasing U.S. domestic launch capacity is in the national security interest of the United States. We expected in 1988 that reliance on foreign launches would be a temporary expedient. It has become a 10-year way of life, and it is time for us to recognize that unless America becomes the unquestioned leader in access to space commercially, we will have serious military downsides as well. Finally, with respect to the exchange of information by U.S. firms and PRC scientists, is that what you were asking about? But with respect to that topic, as Representative Lucille Roybal-Allard mentioned, we need to do a much different job, not just a better job, but a different job of monitoring the launches overseas. the pre-launch process, the whole launch campaign, and the activities in the PRC themselves.
Scientists.
And at the national laboratories. We need simply to pay attention to counterintelligence in a serious way. This doesn't mean that there can't be international cooperation, to the contrary. But what it does mean is that everybody plays by the same rules and follows them. And I think impliedly here, we've been very polite about it, you can also sense that while we are perfectly willing to place blame on the departments of our government that bore this responsibility and didn't properly execute it, we are not willing to forgive people engaged in espionage, and if we catch them, they should be executed.
You go ahead. Go ahead.
I'd like us both to answer these. Why don't you handle that question?
Go ahead, Chris.
The problem starts at the top naturally, because that's where the direction has to come from. I think it is a happy coincidence that we have a brand new Secretary of Energy at the same time that all of these disclosures are being made public, because he doesn't have the personal burden of having to apologize for anything that's gone before. And what I have seen Secretary Richardson undertake during the time that our Select Committee has been investigating this matter is very promising. We need a change in direction. It has to be forced from the top, because what we have heard in our hearings, for example, with respect to the national laboratories, is that they have resisted DOE direction in the past. They have resisted the counterintelligence directives that have come from Washington. We are taking steps not only in legislation recommended by the Select Committee, but in legislation already passed in the last year to bolster the responsibility that Washington can effectively carry out vis-a-vis the laboratories.
Let me just say one brief word on this. 2 other times in the last 10 years, there was a counterintelligence initiative to try to correct the problems at the labs. They were resisted, and they didn't succeed. I believe that when President Clinton signed PDD 61 in February of '98, and Secretary Richardson accepted all of Ed Curran's recommendations that were put together over those months, there was a real commitment. And I think the fact that this committee unanimously came down very hard on the Department of Energy is going to ensure that those recommendations will be put into place. Yesterday, we received an update from Secretary Richardson on the implementation of his plan. I'm told he's going to have a press conference today with Ed Curran to tell you exactly what is being. And when our report ended in January, the chairman and I felt that the situation out there was very bad. And that but I'm telling you, in the last 5 months, while we've been going through declassification, they've been making real progress out there. But this has to mean a culture change, and this also means that Congress has to give them the money, the tools, the mandate, the legislation to get this job done, and we've got to stay on top of this and make sure it happens.
Could you comment on Mark new technology week? Given the damage that was done to the nuclear weapons knowledge base, the fact that these labs were managed by the University of California, should the University of California be allowed to continue managing Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore?
Well, one of the things that we recommended is that we take a look at how these laboratories are managed and look at whether there is a better way to do this. Now, I'm not prepared here today to make any definitive recommendation myself. I think that this is a serious matter. I know that the President has ordered the PIFIAD to look into these matters, and I think Congress needs to have good oversight, good hearings, look at the structure, and see if changes need to be made and how we protect these secrets. And currently, the system didn't work. We need a new system, I believe.
Mr. Dick's comment on what impact this report will have and should have on the United States' relations with China, and specifically the upcoming MFN situation?
Well, I think actually Doug Beereiter addressed the question about U.S.-PRC relations fairly directly. There is nothing in our report that foreordains a particular policy towards the People's Republic of China, except with respect to our security arrangements and our counterintelligence. I personally think it is a very useful thing for the People's Republic of China to be admitted to the WTO on commercially acceptable terms, and I personally believe that they have not met that standard thus far. But I would separate that set of issues from security issues such as the extent of our military cooperation and the extent of our preparedness and counterintelligence issues which respond directly to the espionage threat that is outlined so richly in our three-volume report.
I just want to say this. I think it would be a mistake for us to change our basic policy towards China. I believe the mistakes that were made here, as Kurt Weldon said, were mistakes in our own government. We're the ones that let this happen. So I hope that we will still continue a policy of engagement with our eyes open and deal with the Chinese as we used to deal with the Soviets. We tell them the problems we think they've got with their system. They tell us the same problems with us. I think we still need to engage with China. And I would hate to see this report create a circumstance in which we go to a Cold War setting with China. I think that would be a mistake.
Good statement.
Yeah.
Did you get during the investigation to establish why the Chinese, after all these years, have not deployed the secrets that they stole on nuclear warheads? They haven't miniaturized their warheads, or they haven't used multiple warheads. Why not?
What the Select Committee has found is that classified information on 7 separate warheads has been acquired by the People's Republic of China. Part of the way that we know this is from the now famous walk-in document, which is described in some detail in Volume 1 of our report. But there are other ways that we know about this, and piecing it together, we can't tell you definitively, for example, when this information was acquired. The walk-in document itself was presented by the MSS to our CIA, ultimately directly, originally indirectly, in 1995. The document is dated 1988, but a walk-in providing lots of documents is undoubtedly providing some, or at least we ought to suspect, might be providing some disinformation. So we tested the technical information in the document and found out they really had our classified design information on, for example, the W-88. We can't empirically test the 1988 date. So there's no reason to assume that 1988 is the real date that they acquired that information. We know from other information such as testing that they must have had the W-88 by 1992. And with respect to the other information in that document, we know they got it before 1995. Separately, we have said in our report that we expect that the DF-31, one of their new planned long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, will be tested this year. And we expect that it could be deployed as early as 2002. And further, that when it is deployed, it's our judgment that the warhead sitting on top of that will embody elements of stolen U.S. designs for miniature warheads.
With all the security lapses that you and your colleagues have found, who then is being held accountable for any of this?
The question of accountability for the things that went wrong, and obviously a great deal here was not done as it ought to have, is being taken up by a number of committees, including the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, to the extent that this deals with problems in intelligence and counterintelligence. Our report that we are giving you today, it bears repeating, is dated January 3. So this is the state of knowledge as of January 3. This is what we reported to Congress and our government at that time. And because the classified information in our report, even more than we're providing you today, was made available to, for example, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and of course the House Intelligence Committee was virtually represented on the Select Committee, those committees and their staff have been pursuing this in real time during the 5 months since then. Other committees, such as the Commerce Committee, where I serve, which has jurisdiction over the Department of Energy, undoubtedly will be pursuing this in hearings, and I think that this is a proper place for Congress to continue to exercise its oversight responsibilities.
I want to say wait a minute. I want to say a word here. On this question, Secretary Richardson said that he is going to hold people accountable at the Department of Energy for their failure to implement these previous counterintelligence efforts, and I think that's totally appropriate, and I encourage him to do it.
In a statement that Tom DeLay put out as you were releasing the report, he said, quote, "We are forced to question whether the President and Vice President deliberately ignored the reality of Chinese spying and theft because they, the President and Vice President, had ulterior economic and political motives." Having studied this subject for so long, do you think that's open to question and should be studied?
In fact, I watched a little television before I came in here today, and it's hard to miss the general discussion that surrounds the release of our report. I think all of us today heartily wish that each of you will read our report and draw your own inferences. That sort of inference is something that it is possible for a person to reach based on reading our report, but it is not the sort of thing that would have permitted us to put out this report if we engaged in it. That's not what we're doing today. This report is not inferences. It's not suspicions or things that we cannot prove. It is rather the facts. And I think it's vitally important for us today to emphasize that this is a fact-based report. We stuck to the facts. We appreciate that in a nation of 250 million people, there are going to be all sorts of inferences drawn from those facts, and we are responsible only for our own opinions from this point forward.
I'd just like to say a word about that. First of all, I believe that the President acted with PDD 61 as soon as he was briefed. In fact, he was briefed, as I understand it, and as the chairman mentioned, in July or August of 1997, and they started then to implement PDD 61, which was put in place in February of '98. That is the basis for the current counterintelligence program. So I went down and looked at the briefing material that had been received in '96, and I believe that that Berger acted properly, and unfortunately, all of us wished on the committee, on the Intelligence Committee, and in the government, that people had said in '84 or '88 that we had this problem and we ought to get it straightened out. But this is the first president who's done something about it with PDD 61, and Secretary Richardson is implementing the new counterintelligence program. So at least this administration, may be late, it got it right, and this committee, I think, was one of the major reasons why they were spurred forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Good job.
All right.
I'm glad what you said, what you did by China.
That was a great statement.